Okay. Well, thank you, Sergio, and it's a pleasure to be here. I apologize. I don't speak Portuguese. I don't speak Spanish, but I really enjoy my time in Brazil. The last time I was in Brazil, it was an inopportune time because it was the week of the riots in 2012 or 2013, and I would tell my wife every day, "Don't worry, honey, I'm fine. Don't worry." Until the very last day, when I'm almost at the airport and they have a riot that shuts down the airport for 4 or 5 hours sitting on the freeway. But it all worked out in the end. So it's a pleasure to be here. I want to talk about this question, which is really, I think, a central question. It's a question that's really being discussed and debated all around the world, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. What's happening with the labor market, and is this new wave of technology that we all are reading about or experiencing, is it going to lead to some kinds of changes that are going to be negative and disruptive? So I want to try to bring a little bit of maybe some evidence to the debate and talk what I think, and I think Manuel and I both agree that the most important question really is not about predicting this, but about how to respond to whatever's going to happen in the technology and labor market issue. So that's ITIF. We're a think tank in Washington. ITIF.org is the URL, and we've been around about 11 years and focus really on questions around policy questions around innovation. A lot of it in IT, but not only. I'm going to turn this down. There we go. Okay. So we've written lots of different reports. If you see that one up there, it's going to kill us, and 4 other myths about AI. This was a report that argued that artificial intelligence is not going to kill us. It's not all powerful, as people like Elon Musk say. So that's kind of the thing. So I want to talk really 4 things. Claims about technology and work. What does history, at least in the US, tell us, which can be somewhat valuable? Is the future going to be discontinuous and going to be different? And finally, what should policymakers do? So when you listen to futurists and others, they generally say that something is happening that's really unprecedented, and they give a number to it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, infinite, and these are all implying that something's really different. So they make this claim that we're not just going along like we've gone along in the past, but something is happening that's different around technology. And one of the core components of that is that Moore's law is speeding up. Moore's law is basically the semiconductor or the processor in our computers doubles every 18 months. And it has been doubling every 18 months since Gordon Moore predicted that back in the 1960s, except for the last few years when it is slowing down dramatically. For the first time in world history, the price of what's called the MIP, millions of instructions per second, has actually been going up, not down. So when these people are saying that information technology is progressing exponentially, they were talking about the past. They're not talking about the present or the future. Making these things faster is really, really hard when you're down to 16 to 18 nanometers width on the circuits. You can't really get down below 9. So you have to think up some whole new architecture like quantum computing, which, okay, fine, we can talk about quantum computing, but it's a long, long way off before you and I are going to have a quantum computing cell phone. A long way off, like 30, 40 years minimum. So anyway, they claim that there's this new technology and it's leading to exponential change. Okay, if you remember your math in school, an exponent means it doubles every. Look at the innovation metrics of any country in the world, and they're not doubling. They're increasing arithmetically. Patents are increasing 4 or 5% a year. New technology startups increasing maybe 3 or 4% a year. Corporate inventions. Nothing's growing exponentially here. It's just growing arithmetically. And finally, they say that this change is leading to unprecedented job loss, which is really interesting because if you look at least the US, we have the lowest unemployment rate we've had in probably 40 years. But people like Martin Ford, technology is taking all our jobs. According to Martin Ford, he's a writer, a Silicon Valley writer, 75% job loss 75% unemployment by the year 2110. And he's actually on the conservative side. There are people now saying 90% unemployment. We're all going to be the immiserated proletariat, dependent upon the benefits of the state with universal basic income. So this is kind of the elite class who are what they are saying, 75% unemployment. Vivek Wadhwa, the latest, so it used to be 47%, which was what Osborne and Frey at Oxford said, but that's not good enough anymore. Now you got to go to 75, but you want to go to 75? I'll trump that and I'll go to 80%. So it's really a kind of a bidding war on how many of us are going to be out of work. And this is, frankly, in my view, much of it is just to get attention in the press, because if you do what McKinsey did recently and what we did, McKinsey Global Institute did a study, and they found that 45% of U.S. jobs will be impacted by technology, but only about 6% will be eliminated by technology. We did our similar study, we estimated about 8%. That doesn't get quoted. Nobody wants to write about that. In fact, when you read about the McKinsey study, most of the reporters who cite the McKinsey study say that McKinsey said 45% of jobs will be eliminated. They didn't read the study. McKinsey said 45% will be affected. An example of that would be doctors who are using artificial intelligence to make diagnosis. You're not going to go and say, Siri, do I have cancer? You're going to go to a doctor who will have a much better analytical system to then tell you that and then to work with you and care. Okay, so what's the history of all this say? We put together a study using the University of Minnesota's data that they've put together from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. And I won't go into all the details on this, but essentially what we did is we went back and looked at from 1850 in the United States, every decade, so 1860, 70, 80, all the way up to 2010, and then we looked at 2015. And what we looked at in every decade was, at the beginning of the decade, how many jobs in each occupation, and at the end of the decade, how many jobs in each occupation, and then we added up all that change. So if there were 50,000 blacksmiths in 1850 and then 70,000 blacksmiths in 1860, then we'd add 20,000. If they declined, we'd subtract 20,000. And then you add that all together with positive values. And this is an example of what you see with certain occupations. Not surprisingly, locomotive workers, railroad conductors and locomotive engineers, dramatic growth because we, built a national railroad system and we needed people to work on it. So this was a case of technological change driving growth. But then if you look and see where it started to go negative in 1920, what happened in 1920 in the U.S.? Trucks. We finally had trucks that could do some medium haul distance trucking, shipping, and that took market share away. And then as we moved on, we started to get higher productivity in trains. You didn't need 3 engineers or 3, conductors. You only needed 1 or 2. So this is a good example of how technology changes jobs. You get a big growth, and then you usually over time you see a little bit of decline. Another example in the U.S., automotive repair workers. Didn't have a need for an automotive repair worker when we didn't have any autos. Henry Ford, others invented the automobile, and we started to grow that. But then what happened? 2000 peaked. We have more cars in the United States than we did in 2000. What's going on? Well, for all those of you who have a car that's less than 15 years old, you know what's going on. The cars are just so much better built. They have electric ignition systems and computers. They just don't break down as much and don't need as many repairs. So we don't have as many mechanics. Motion pictures, there's another one. Didn't have any motion picture projectionists. That grew, declined in the 1940s. What was going on then? Television. People stopped going to movies as much. They watched television. So these are examples. And then the last one is just growth of computer occupations. When you didn't have computers, really, you didn't have computer occupation growth. So that's an area where technology is creating jobs. Now, put all that together, and what do you see in the U.S.? What you see is that the rate of occupational churn in the last 20 years or 30 years has been at historically low levels in America. You need me to speak closer? No problem. The biggest periods of occupational churn were actually in the last half of the 19th century, when you had farmers and other people off the farm and into the factory. But the last period has been actually pretty stable. So the perception that I think most people have, at least in the United States, is that we're living through a period of unprecedented occupational disruption. You can lose your job anytime. That actually is not true. It's actually the most stable period we've ever had. This is using the similar data. You see the exact same period there. Okay, this is absolute losses of occupation, so just add up all the occupations with a decline, you see the similar pattern. What happened, for example, in the 1970s? One of the big occupational losses in the 1970s was telephone operators. There was a period in time when you wanted to make a call, you actually had to talk to an operator. And they almost never do that anymore because we're using essentially, servers and machines and switches. Okay. Last point on this, there's a big debate. A lot of the optimists say that we shouldn't worry about job loss from technology because technology creates more jobs than it destroys. That really is not true. No enterprise adopts technology if it doesn't save them money or give them more sales. So what you see is that every decade in America, technology has always destroyed more jobs than it's created. Machine tools in factories, computers in offices. They get rid of more jobs than the people making the machine tools or making the computers. So why don't we have unemployment? Because what happens, and this is the fundamental mistake that sort of pessimists make, the single biggest mistake they make is they forget about second order effects. When that office adopts computers and they don't need as many people to answer the telephone or to type in carbon paper. Remember carbon paper? Yeah, I was listening to a podcast by Carl Bernstein, who was a Washington Post reporter who helped with Woodward and Bernstein. He was saying on his first day at work, they played a trick on him and told him he had to go wash the carbon paper at 2 o'clock in the bathroom. So he goes into the bathroom and the chief editor's in there and gets all mad because they're playing a trick on this poor reporter. Nobody uses carbon paper. So anyways, what happens? The price of these services and goods go down. We all have a little bit more money and we go spend it. We might go out and eat another meal at night instead of cooking our own meal. We might buy a new sofa or a couch. We might do whatever. Might take a trip. And that creates new jobs elsewhere. So that's really what's happened over the last 200 years, and there's no reason to expect it's not going to keep happening. Unfortunately, what you have is this long history of predictions that technology is going to make us all unemployed. I love these predictions because they were all about artificial intelligence. 40, 50 years ago, I would imagine that if they're alive today, they would sort of have to say that they were mistaken. A little bit like Marxists who kept thinking the proletariat revolution was just around the corner, and if it hadn't happened yet, eventually it was going to happen. So the skeptics would hear my argument and they would say, that's all fine, we agree with you, but this time it's different. Something's different now, and all of the past experience is now irrelevant. Let me suggest why that's not the case. Best claim for that is Klaus Schwab, head of the World Economic Forum. The fourth industrial revolution, which actually isn't the fourth, it's, if you believe in long-wave theory, it's the sixth, Schumpeterian long-wave theory. You read Schwab in his book, it's like this is like bigger than the first industrial revolution, unprecedented, It's not. It's just a sort of regular 50-year cycle of change we're almost going to happen, and it's not going to be all that much different than what happened in the 1950s or 60s or the 1910s and the 1920s. My famous quote there is Rodney Brooks, a famous roboticist at MIT, runs a robot company, and the great line is, just because we've invented the internal combustion engine doesn't mean that warp drive is coming tomorrow. So just because I can talk to this thing, I can talk to Siri and she can sort of help me a little bit, doesn't mean that Siri is going to take over and be able to do everything. It's a fundamental point. Artificial intelligence isn't really all that intelligent, and it's not going to be. There's a big debate, but there's what they call artificial general intelligence. In other words, could you build a machine that is equally as capable as a human being? And the answer is certainly not in the next 50 to 100 years. Maybe conceptually you could. This is so hard to do. So incredibly hard to do. And when you talk to leading AI scientists, they will tell you how hard it is. Just underneath all of this stuff are a bunch of just algorithms and Markov chains and this and that, and they can do if A, then B. When I want to come down to Brazil, it wasn't just A or B. It was an incredibly complex thing. I had to negotiate. I had to figure things out. Computer can't do that and won't be able to do that. Second point is technological change in the labor market is always slow. We forget about it. This is elevator operators in the U.S. We didn't have any elevator operators till we had elevators. Built elevators because we needed elevators in big, tall steel buildings. And then in 1923, Otis Elevator invented the self-service elevator. It took until mid-1980s to get rid of all the elevator operators in America. So that was a 60-year process of transformation. Why? Well, because you had these elevators that were there. People didn't want to just rip them out. You had resistance. You had resistance from the workers. You had resistance from people who didn't trust push-button elevators. You know, we're human beings. We're all irrational, most of us, many of us, at least everybody on something. So these things take a long time. The other thing is it's really, really hard to automate occupations. These are some that Osborne and Frey will say will be gone in 20 years. Anybody imagine that in 20 years, especially the ladies in the room, that you're going to let a robot cut your hair? I don't think so.
See what happens.
Seems like we're talking prima facie example here. You don't want to end up like Sergio. But, you know, anybody ever tried to install carpet? My wife had me install a carpet in our basement. It's really, really hard to do. You know, complex. Robots can't do this. And my favorite is school bus drivers. I'm happy to acknowledge or believe that at some point in time, maybe 30 years, you'll have fully autonomous school buses. Anybody with kids here who like in middle school, like 10-year-olds, would you let your kids go on a bus with no adult? No. It'd be like Lord of the Flies, you know, just like a total chaos. Kids beating on each other, it'd be a nightmare. That's why we have people, adults. They may not be a driver, but there'll be somebody on the bus. Okay, as I said, most occupations really hard to automate. Let me just sort of wrap up. I think the other component of this is that you would imagine that if there are these big labor market negative impacts, that in economies where there's high productivity, you would have high unemployment. There's just simply no correlation between that. We looked at average unemployment and change in productivity. You get all sorts of different numbers there, but they all add up to no relationship. The reason, as I said before, is because high productivity leads to savings. Savings create demand, and demand creates jobs. People don't put their money under the mattress when they have saved money. They spend it. Another component of this is a lot of the technology people fear really is not going to replace humans. It will complement humans. It will make their job easier, and it'll improve quality. I mentioned healthcare. But educational technology is not going to replace teachers. It's just going to give teachers a lot better tools to customize their education, their pedagogy to the student. Just, you know, lots and lots of really helpful things that this technology is going to do. And lastly, this I think is an important point. Human needs are close to being infinite. You know, if you made Brazilian per capita income up by a factor of 10 and asked the average Brazil worker, I'm going to guess the average Brazil worker makes about, I'm going to say $15,000 maybe.
15,000, less than that.
All right, so 12,000, let's just say.
Annually, you're saying?
Annually.
Well, I have to do the math, yeah.
Okay, so but let's just say 15.
Less than that.
All right, 15. You're now going to make $150,000. You got to worry about, you don't think you'll be able to spend money on $150,000? I mean, you know, how about buying nicer clothes? How about building an extension on your home? How about maybe sending your kid to, to college? Human needs are infinite. I put that one on there in the upper middle because I am 2 meters tall. And so if I could double my income, I would never fly coach for the rest of my life. We had that discussion here. And I pay for it, but I can't afford it, especially when I'm traveling with my family. So point is, we're never going to run out of things we need, and there's always going to be workers for it. So given that, what should policymakers do? Let me just stipulate for the moment, I do believe that we're in this uptick of a new technology wave around autonomy, robotics, AI, nanotechnology. And I do believe that that's going to lead to an uptick in productivity. But I don't think it's going to be any more transformative than with the last wave, which we went up, at least in the US, to say 3%, and we're now 1%. So, we might get up to 3. If we're really lucky, we'll get to 4. But what do we need to do? First of all, here's what you don't need to do is panic. A number of policymakers, at least in Washington, members of Congress I've talked to, are in a panic. Slow the rate of innovation and automation. So the fact that somebody like Bill Gates and Robert Shiller at Yale can talk seriously and not be laughed out of the room that we should impose taxes on robots so we slow their adoption, or the European Parliament recently passed a law that would give robots rights, and I'm sorry that I dropped you. These are machines. There's actually an interesting study at Carnegie Mellon where they had these little robots that had some little quasi-autonomy, and they would move, and then they would tell people to hit them with a baseball bat, and most people would hit them. And then they said, this robot's name is Sally, and she's in a really good mood today, and Sally has a wonderful personality. Like, only 50% of the people would now kill Sally, the robot, or the little thing. So we tend to anthropomorphize these things. And the last thing is this notion of universal basic income. I think it would be a disaster. Universal basic income is that the state gives every adult a monthly stipend. I think it would be a disaster because A, we don't have that much money, and B, it would just encourage people not to work, and the longer people are out of the labor market, the sort of more rusty their skills become, and it becomes really difficult to ever get back in the labor market. So we don't need to do that. What should we do? Number one, policymakers should speed up the rate of automation and productivity. I know that maybe sounds strange, but you look at Brazil. This is really, to me, one of the central economic challenges Brazil faces. This is labor productivity from 2009, 2017, and you can see Brazil ranks last among these countries. The fact that you were below the U.S., you got to work hard to get below the U.S. because the U.S. is, in economic terms, at the frontier. For us to raise productivity, we got to invent something new. For a country that's not as at the frontier like Brazil is, you don't need to invent as many things. You just need to adopt things that are already there. So it's easier for a country like Brazil to raise productivity. So raising productivity is central. It's how we all raise our standards of living. The second thing, which I think, at least in the U.S., we don't do a very good job of, but there are risks when workers lose their jobs. There is real pain, there's real suffering, and there's real dislocation, family problems, alcoholism goes up, suicide can go up. These aren't trivial matters. And so rather than slow the rate of change, which, for example, what I think Europe is trying to do, the Indian transport minister just recently announced that over his dead body, there would be autonomous vehicles in India. And we wrote an op-ed, which will be in the Indian newspaper this week, which says, fine, you do know that 160,000 people a year are killed in car accidents in India. And if you had autonomous vehicles, that number would go down to less than 10,000. So for him, the jobs are more important than human lives. So, but what he's really channeling there is he's channeling concern about taxi drivers and truckers, and those are legitimate concerns, but the response shouldn't be to stop the technology. It should be to put in place better adjustment policies, health care coverage, unemployment insurance, and most importantly, retraining. I won't go into details on that, but giving employers incentives to train their workers more so that when they do lose a job, they have better and more broadly available skills. Apprenticeship programs, a whole slew of things that countries are doing. And here I would put these Northern European countries at the global leading edge frontier with what they call the flex security system. There's flexibility and security. Countries like Denmark and Sweden do an excellent job. My favorite line, and then I'll stop. I was talking to a Swedish minister once, and he said, you know, in Sweden, we have very powerful labor unions, but we also have a high rate of innovation and productivity. And he said, and the reason is because the head of the Swedish labor movement, he's on record saying, when I go and talk to our companies that have labor union members, my biggest fear is not that they're adopting new technology, it's that they're holding on to old technology. Because I know that if Swedish companies don't use new technology, they're going to go out of business. And they're going to have injuring their workers. And so there is, the reason that the labor union official can say that in Sweden is because he knows that his members will be taken care of. If they lose their job, they'll get help to move on to something else just as good. So with that, I will stop, and I'm just out of time. So thank you.